Of the 307 American soldiers who left on the mission, 32 never came home. 250 were captured or wounded. All 57 vehicles were destroyed. The man they went to rescue was shot before they arrived. And when it was over, General George Patton called it his only mistake of the entire war. But he never admitted the real reason he sent those men to die. His son-in-law was in that camp. This is the story of Task Force Baum, the most controversial mission of World War II, and the secret that Patton took to his grave. In late March 1945, the war in Europe was almost over. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine River and were racing deep into Germany. The Nazi war machine was collapsing. German soldiers were surrendering by the thousands. Victory seemed only weeks away. But for General George Patton, commander of the Third Army, one problem kept him awake at night. Somewhere in Germany, in a prisoner of war camp called Oflagthrieth B, near the town of Hammelburg, American officers were being held captive. And one of those officers was Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, the husband of Patton's daughter Beatrice. Waters had been captured 2 years earlier at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, during one of America's worst defeats of the war. Since then, he had been moved from camp to camp across Europe. In early March 1945, as Soviet forces advanced from the east, the Germans marched Waters and hundreds of other prisoners westward through the freezing cold. They walked 340 miles in 7 weeks, arriving at Hammelburg on March 9th. The camp was miserable. Prisoners received almost no food. Heat was nearly non-existent. Men who had once been strong officers were now walking skeletons too weak to stand for long periods. Patton knew his son-in-law was somewhere in Germany. Intelligence reports suggested Waters might be at Hammelburg, though nothing was certain. The camp lay approximately 50 miles behind German lines, deep in enemy territory. Any rescue attempt would be extremely dangerous. Standard military doctrine said such a mission was impossible without massive force, but Patton was not a man who accepted impossible. He had built his entire career on doing what others said could not be done, and now, with the war almost won, he began planning something that would haunt him forever. On the morning of March 25, 1945, Patton arrived at the headquarters of the 4th Armored Division. This was one of his best units, battle-hardened veterans who had fought across France and into Germany. Patton asked to speak with a young officer named Captain Abraham Baum. Baum was 24 years old, a former pattern cutter from the Bronx who had proven himself an exceptional combat leader. He had been wounded at Normandy and had fought through some of the war's bloodiest battles. When Baum entered the room, he found Patton waiting with several senior officers. Among them was Major Alexander Stiller, one of Patton's personal aides. The atmosphere was tense. Baum could sense that something unusual was happening. Patton wasted no time. He explained that a task force would be sent behind enemy lines to liberate a prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg. The mission would require speed, surprise, and absolute secrecy. Baum would command the operation. The young captain listened carefully, his mind already calculating the risks. 50 miles behind enemy lines, limited forces, no possibility of reinforcement. Every instinct told him this mission was suicide. Baum was not the only one with concerns. Major General Manton Eddy, commander of 23rd Corps, had argued against the mission. So had Brigadier General William Hoge of the 4th Armored Division. Both men believed the force was far too small for such a dangerous operation. They recommended sending a full combat command, roughly 3 times the size of what Patton was proposing. But Patton refused. A larger force would attract too much attention, he said. Speed and surprise were essential. The task force would be small, fast, and deadly. Baum would have approximately 300 men, 10 medium Sherman tanks, 6 light tanks, 27 half-tracks, and various other vehicles. It was enough to fight through scattered resistance, but nowhere near enough to face organized German forces. Baum asked the question that every officer in the room was thinking. Why this camp? Why now? Why risk so many lives for a few hundred prisoners when the war would be over in weeks? Patton's answer was vague. He spoke about the importance of liberating American officers, about morale, about sending a message to the Germans, but he never mentioned his son-in-law. Not once. Before the meeting ended, Patton made Baum an offer. Complete this mission successfully, and Patton would personally recommend him for the Medal of Honor. Baum's response was immediate. He told the general that he had his orders and did not need to be bribed. He would do his duty regardless of any reward. It was exactly the kind of answer Patton respected. As Baum left to prepare, his men, Major Stiller, approached him. The major announced that he would be accompanying the task force on the mission. This was highly unusual. Stiller was a staff officer, not a combat commander. He had no tactical role to play in such an operation. Baum found this strange, but said nothing. What he did not know was that Stiller had a specific purpose. He personally knew what Lieutenant Colonel John Waters looked like. His job was to identify Patton's son-in-law among the prisoners and ensure his rescue. The deception was now complete. Patton had organized an entire military operation, risking hundreds of American lives without telling anyone the true reason. The mission was scheduled to begin that evening. Task Force Baum would move out under cover of darkness. At 2100 hours on March 26th, Task Force Baum crossed into enemy territory. The column stretched for nearly a mile, vehicles moving slowly through the darkness with headlights off. Baum rode in a jeep near the front, studying maps and calculating distances. The plan was simple in concept, but extremely difficult in execution. They would drive east through German lines, avoid major enemy concentrations, reach the camp, free the prisoners, and return the same way. The entire operation was supposed to take less than 48 hours. For the first few miles, everything went smoothly. German resistance was light, mostly scattered sentries who were quickly overwhelmed. The task force pushed deeper into enemy territory, passing through small villages and crossing open fields. But the element of surprise did not last long. German communications were still functioning, and word of the American column spread quickly. By midnight, German commanders knew something unusual was happening. An American armored force was driving east, away from the front lines, heading deeper into Germany. The question was why, and the answer would soon become terrifyingly clear. The first serious fight came at the town of Gemünden, where Task Force Baum needed to cross the Saale River. German forces had been alerted and were waiting. As Baum's lead tanks approached the bridge, enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Machine guns raked the column. Anti-tank weapons targeted the Shermans. The task force returned fire, but the Germans had the advantage of prepared positions. Baum ordered his men to push through, knowing that stopping meant death. In the chaos of the firefight, several American vehicles were destroyed. Men were killed and wounded, but the column kept moving, fighting through the town street by street. Then came disaster. As the Americans tried to cross the bridge, German engineers detonated explosives. The bridge collapsed into the river, taking several vehicles with it. Baum was now trapped on the wrong side of the Saale with a wounded force and no clear path forward. He had lost tanks, half-tracks, and most importantly, men. The mission was barely 12 hours old, and already Task Force Baum was in serious trouble. Baum found another crossing point and pushed his battered column forward. By now, his force had been significantly reduced. Several tanks had been lost. Ammunition was running low. His men had been fighting continuously for hours with no rest. But the camp was still miles away, and stopping was not an option. The deeper they drove into Germany, the more resistance they encountered. German forces were converging on their position from multiple directions. Local commanders had identified the American column and were organizing counterattacks. What had started as scattered resistance was becoming coordinated opposition. Baum drove his men relentlessly. They fought through roadblocks, ambushes, and small unit engagements. Every mile cost them more vehicles, more ammunition, more lives. By the afternoon of March 27th, Task Force Baum had been fighting for nearly 18 hours straight. They were exhausted, bloodied, and deep behind enemy lines with no hope of reinforcement. But they were also close. The prisoner of war camp at Hammelburg was now only a few miles away. Baum could see the town in the distance. The camp appeared on a hillside south of Hammelburg. As Baum's surviving vehicles approached, his heart sank. Intelligence had told him to expect approximately 300 American officers. What he saw was something far worse. The camp held not 300 prisoners, but nearly 1,500 Americans, plus thousands of Serbian prisoners, in an adjacent compound. There was no possible way to evacuate that many men. His remaining vehicles could carry perhaps 200 at most. The rest would have to walk 50 miles through enemy territory or be left behind. Baum later described his reaction as overwhelming frustration. He felt physically sick. The mission had been difficult enough with 300 prisoners. With 1,500, it was mathematically impossible, but the task force had come too far to turn back now. Baum ordered his men to breach the camp perimeter. Tanks crashed through the fences. American soldiers poured through the gaps. Inside, hundreds of emaciated prisoners emerged from their barracks, cheering and crying at the sight of their rescuers. After years in captivity, freedom had finally arrived. But the celebration would be tragically short-lived. As the Americans entered the camp, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters walked toward the main gate. He wanted to negotiate with German guards to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. A white flag was raised. Waters approached the German position slowly, hands visible, clearly indicating peaceful intentions. Then a shot rang out. A German guard, either confused or panicked, fired a single round. The bullet struck Waters in the lower back, shattering his pelvis and causing severe internal injuries. He collapsed in the dirt, bleeding heavily. American soldiers dragged him back inside the camp and rushed him to the Serbian hospital within the compound. The medical staff did what they could, but Waters was in critical condition. He would survive, but he could not be moved. The very man that this entire mission was designed to rescue was now unable to escape. The cruel irony was almost unbearable. Patton had sent 307 men on a suicide mission to save his son-in-law, and now his son-in-law lay in a hospital bed, too wounded to be saved. The mission had failed before it truly began. Baum faced an impossible decision. He had to leave immediately if any of his men were to survive. German forces were closing in from all directions. Every minute he stayed at the camp increased the danger exponentially, but he could not take all the prisoners. He announced that only field-grade officers, majors, and above would ride in the vehicles. Lower-ranking officers could march alongside the column if they chose, but most would have to stay behind. The reaction among the prisoners was heartbreaking. Men who had spent years dreaming of freedom watched as their rescuers prepared to leave them. Some volunteered to walk, others, too weak from starvation, knew they could never make the 50-mile journey. Senior officers tried to maintain order, but the situation was chaos. At 2,000 hours, Task Force Baum began its withdrawal from the camp. The column now included dozens of prisoners riding on tanks, half-tracks, and jeeps. Hundreds more walked alongside. But the force that had entered Germany the previous night was now a shadow of itself, and the Germans were waiting. The return journey was a nightmare. German forces had completely surrounded the area. Anti-tank guns covered every road. Infantry units blocked every escape route. Baum tried to break through multiple times, but each attempt cost him more vehicles and more men. His tanks ran out of ammunition. His half-tracks were picked off one by one. The walking prisoners, exhausted and malnourished, could not keep pace with the vehicles. Many were recaptured within hours of leaving the camp. By midnight, Task Force Baum had ceased to exist as a coherent military unit. Survivors scattered into the woods, trying to escape individually or in small groups. Baum himself was wounded, shot in the groin during a firefight. He crawled through the darkness, bleeding and in agony, until German soldiers found him at dawn. The young captain who had led 307 men into Germany was now a prisoner himself. He was taken to the very camp he had tried to liberate and placed in the same Serbian hospital where John Waters lay recovering. The two men, brought together by Patton's secret mission, would spend the next days as prisoners together. The destruction of Task Force Baum was complete. Of the 307 men who began the mission, 32 were killed in action. The exact number of wounded varied in different reports, but most estimates placed it above 50. Nearly all the survivors, including Baum himself, were captured. Only 35 men managed to escape and return to American lines. Every single vehicle was lost. All 16 tanks destroyed. All 27 half-tracks destroyed. Every jeep, every truck, every piece of equipment gone. The Germans celebrated what they called a great victory. Propaganda broadcasts announced that German forces had destroyed an entire American armored division at Hammelburg. The claim was exaggerated, but the underlying truth was devastating enough. Patton's secret mission had ended in total catastrophe. Back at 3rd Army headquarters, Patton received the reports in silence. His staff watched him carefully, expecting an explosion of rage, but Patton said nothing. For once, the general who always had something to say was speechless. He had gambled with the lives of 307 men, and he had lost. 9 days after the failed raid, American forces reached Hammelburg through conventional military operations. The 14th Armored Division liberated the camp on April 6, 1945, freeing all the prisoners the Task Force Baum had been unable to rescue. Among those freed were John Waters and Abraham Baum, both still recovering from their wounds. When Patton learned that his son-in-law was safe, he immediately traveled to the hospital. The meeting between the two men was private, but witnesses reported that Patton was visibly emotional. He spent considerable time at his son-in-law's bedside before turning to other matters. Baum was also visited by the general. Patton pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on the young captain's chest, the second highest award for valor in the United States Army. But it was not the Medal of Honor that Patton had promised. That award required an official investigation, and Patton wanted no investigation. Any inquiry into Task Force Baum would reveal the true motivation behind the mission. The secret had to be protected, even if it meant breaking a promise to a brave young officer. In the weeks that followed, the full story of Task Force Baum slowly emerged. Journalists began asking questions. How had such a small force been sent on such a dangerous mission? Why had senior officers' objections been overruled? And, most importantly, why had Patton's son-in-law been in the very camp that was targeted? The connections were impossible to ignore. Patton defended himself with characteristic aggression. He claimed the mission was intended as a diversion to support 3rd Army's northward movement. He insisted he had not known for certain that Waters was at Hammelburg. He described the operation as a calculated military risk that had simply failed, but the evidence contradicted him. Letters Patton wrote to his wife on the day the mission launched specifically mentioned Waters and the camp. Major Stiller's presence on the mission, a staff officer with no combat role, only made sense if his job was to identify Waters. And the size of the force, too small to succeed but small enough to avoid attracting high-level attention, suggested Patton knew this mission would be questioned. Historians have debated Patton's motives for decades. Some argue that he genuinely believed the mission could succeed and that rescuing his son-in-law was only a secondary consideration. Others contend that the entire operation was designed specifically to save Waters, with the liberation of other prisoners serving as convenient cover. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Patton was not a monster. He cared about his men and rarely threw lives away carelessly, but he was also a man of intense personal loyalty, especially to family. The thought of his daughter's husband rotting in a German prison camp possibly being executed as the Reich collapsed, must have been unbearable. In his mind, he probably convinced himself that the mission could work, that the risks were acceptable, that the potential reward justified the potential cost. But 32 American families received telegrams informing them that their sons, fathers, and husbands would never come home. For them, Patton's motivations mattered little. Their loved ones were dead. After the war ended, Patton addressed Task Force Baum in his memoir. His words were carefully chosen. He wrote that throughout the campaign in Europe, he knew of no error he made, except that of failing to send a combat command to take Hammelburg. It was a remarkable admission from a man who rarely acknowledged mistakes. But notice what he admitted and what he did not. He confessed that the force was too small. He did not confess why he kept it small. He did not admit that a larger force would have attracted Eisenhower's attention and required official approval. He did not acknowledge that secrecy, not speed, was the real reason for the mission's limited size. Patton took the truth about Task Force Baum to his grave. He died in December 1945, just months after the war ended, following injuries sustained in a car accident. He never faced a formal inquiry into the mission. He never testified about his motives. He never had to look the families of the dead in the eye and explain why their sons died for his son-in-law. Abraham Baum survived the war and returned to America. He lived until 2013, dying at age 91 in California. Throughout his life, he remained conflicted about the mission that defined his military career. In interviews decades later, he expressed both pride in his men's bravery and bitterness about the circumstances that sent them to their deaths. Baum always maintained that Patton had deceived him. He had been told to expect 300 prisoners, not 1,500. He had been promised support that never came. He had been sent on a mission that his commanders knew was impossible. When Patton visited him in the hospital and said the mission was not just about one man, Baum responded with barely concealed anger. He told the general that it was difficult to believe 307 men had been sent on such a mission to rescue just one man. Patton's reply was cold and quick. "That's right, Abe. I wouldn't." But Baum never believed him. He went to his grave, convinced that he and his men had been sacrificed for a father-in-law's love. John Waters recovered from his wounds and continued his military career. He rose to the rank of 4-star general, one of the highest ranks in the United States Army, and served with distinction for decades after the war. He rarely spoke publicly about Task Force Baum or his father-in-law's role in organizing it. The relationship between Waters and Patton remained close until the general's death. Whether Waters ever confronted Patton about the mission, whether he felt gratitude or guilt or some combination of both, remains unknown. He kept his private thoughts private, but the shadow of Hammelburg followed him throughout his life. Whenever his name appeared in military history's Task Force Baum was mentioned, he could never fully escape the knowledge that 32 men died trying to rescue him, that hundreds more were wounded or captured, that an entire military operation had been launched because he had married the right woman. For Waters, survival must have been a complicated blessing. He lived, but the weight of that survival never fully lifted. Task Force Baum remains one of the most controversial operations of World War II. It represents the intersection of military duty and personal loyalty, of command authority and moral responsibility. Patton was one of history's greatest generals, a commander whose speed and aggression helped win the war in Europe. But he was also a man capable of sending 307 soldiers on a mission designed primarily to rescue his own family member. The men of Task Force Baum were not volunteers. They were soldiers following orders, trusting that their commanders would not waste their lives on personal missions. That trust was betrayed. Whether Patton was a loving father-in-law or a commander who abused his power depends on perspective. But one fact cannot be debated. 32 American soldiers died on that mission. They left behind families who never learned the full truth about why their loved ones were sent to die. And that truth, hidden for decades, remains Task Force Baum's most lasting legacy: a general's secret, a family's tragedy, and 30 graves that should never have been dug. Patton called it his only mistake of the war, but was it a mistake or was it a choice? A choice to value one man above 307 others. What would you have done in his position? Would you risk everything to save someone you love? Or would duty come first? The men of Task Force Baum never got to make that choice. It was made for them. Tell me what you think in the comments. Was Patton a hero who made one terrible decision, or a man who betrayed the soldiers who trusted him? I want to hear your answer.